My parents told me for 18 years I was adopted as a joke, so I found my real family. The adoption joke started before I could form memories, which meant I grew up believing it was normal for parents to tell their son he didn't belong to them. "We found you in a box behind the supermarket," my father would say during breakfast, and my mother would add details about how they almost called social services, but decided to keep me because they needed someone to mow the lawn eventually. They'd laugh while I sat at the table trying to figure out if this was funny or cruel, and by the time I was 7, I'd learned to laugh along because that's what they expected. My younger sister Vanessa never got the adoption jokes, only me, and when I asked why, my father said it was because I looked nothing like him. He'd stand me next to him in front of the bathroom mirror and point out how his hair was blonde while mine was dark and curly, his eyes were blue while mine were brown, his skin was pale while mine had an olive tone that tanned easily. Every birthday brought a new version of the story with details that changed each time for maximum entertainment value. My 9th birthday featured my mother telling relatives that they'd gotten me from a woman at the bus station who couldn't afford another child. My 12th birthday cake said, "Happy Fake Sunday," in blue frosting, and when my grandmother looked confused, my father explained it was an inside family joke that I thought was hilarious. I stopped inviting friends over after my best friend Lucas asked his parents why my mom and dad kept saying they weren't really my parents, and Lucas's mother called to express concern about the psychological impact. My mother told her some people couldn't understand dark humor, and we shouldn't expect everyone to appreciate our family dynamic, but Lucas stopped coming over after that and eventually stopped talking to me at school. The school counselor, Mr. Ramirez, pulled me aside in 8th grade after I'd written a short story for English class about a boy who discovers he's from another planet. He asked if everything was okay at home, and I told him my parents liked to joke about me being adopted, even though I probably wasn't. Mr. Ramirez's expression shifted to something that looked like professional concern, and he asked how often these jokes happened. When I said multiple times a week for as long as I could remember, he suggested we bring my parents in for a conference to discuss appropriate family communication. I told him that would make things worse, and he gave me his card and said to come talk whenever I needed to, but I never went back because I knew he couldn't fix my parents. High school brought new variations on the theme when my father started making jokes about how I must have gotten my athletic ability from my real father, because no one in our family could run that fast. I'd made the varsity track team as a freshman, and instead of being proud, he turned it into another opportunity to remind me I was different. My mother joined in by saying I probably inherited my mathematical skills from some genius sperm donor they'd used, even though they'd always claimed I was adopted from a bus station or a dumpster or wherever the story placed me that week. Vanessa would look uncomfortable during these conversations, but never defended me, and I learned that my sister's silence was its own form of agreement with our parents' narrative. The college application process revealed something disturbing when my mother casually suggested I check different boxes for ethnicity because I clearly wasn't the same background as the rest of the family. I was filling out forms at the kitchen table and asked what she meant, and she said I should mark whatever felt honest, since we'd never really known my true origins anyway. My father added that this could help with scholarships and admissions, since universities love diversity, and they both acted like this was practical advice rather than an admission that their 18 years of jokes might have been based in reality. I stared at the form while my hands started shaking, and my mother said I was being too sensitive like always, and should just pick something and submit the application. I started searching through family documents late at night when my parents were asleep, looking for evidence of adoption papers, or proof that I actually belonged to them. My birth certificate was in a filing cabinet in the den, and when I found it, everything appeared legitimate with my mother and father listed as parents and the local hospital, and my birth date all matching what I'd been told. I took a photo with my phone and spent hours researching whether birth certificates could be falsified or if adopted children received new certificates with their adoptive parents listed. The internet suggested both were possible, which meant the certificate proved nothing either way. Baby photos showed an infant who could have been anyone, and the few pictures of my mother pregnant could have been with Vanessa since the photos weren't labeled. DNA testing kits were advertised everywhere, and I ordered one using money from my job at the hardware store. The kit arrived in plain packaging, and I followed the instructions in my bedroom, sealing the saliva sample and mailing it back before my parents could discover what I was doing. The results would take 6 to 8 weeks, and I spent that time imagining what I'd find. Maybe I'd discover biological relatives who actually wanted me, or maybe I'd confirm that my parents had been disguising the truth as jokes for my entire childhood. My father found the empty box in my car and asked what I needed a DNA test for, and I told him it was for a biology class project. He accepted this without questions and told me to take out the trash. The email notification arrived on a Wednesday afternoon while I was at school. I waited until I got home and locked myself in my bedroom before opening the results on my laptop. My ethnicity estimate showed Middle Eastern, Southern European, and North African ancestry, which didn't match my parents' Irish and German background at all. The genetic relative matches showed dozens of people I'd never heard of, with the closest matches being second and third cousins. I sat on my bed staring at the screen while my stomach twisted into knots, trying to process what this meant. Either my parents really had adopted me and lied about it, or one of them wasn't my biological parent, or something else entirely had happened that they'd been hiding behind jokes. I created a document with my closest DNA matches and started sending messages through the testing platform. Most people never responded, but a few wrote back asking how we were related and sharing basic family information. One match, a man named Victor who showed as a possible second cousin, responded within a day saying he was passionate about genealogy and would help figure out our connection. He asked for my parents' names and where they were from, and when I gave him the information, he went silent for 3 days. When he finally messaged back, he said he'd searched extensively and couldn't find any connection between his family tree and the names I'd provided, but our DNA suggested we shared great-grandparents somewhere in the line. Victor asked if I knew anything about my grandparents or extended family, and I realized I knew almost nothing. My father's parents had moved to Florida before I was born, and we'd visited them maybe 3 times in my life. My mother's parents were supposedly dead, though I'd never seen graves or death certificates or any proof they'd existed at all. We had no cousins visiting for holidays, no family reunions, no contact with aunts or uncles. Victor's questions made me realize how isolated my family was, which seemed convenient if you were hiding something significant. I told Victor I'd try to get more information and started planning how to confront my parents with evidence they couldn't dismiss as easily as they'd dismissed everything else. The confrontation happened on a Friday night when both my parents were home and Vanessa was at a sleepover. I walked into the living room with my laptop and told them I'd taken a DNA test, and the results showed I wasn't genetically related to either of them. My mother's face went pale, and my father asked why the hell I'd done something like that without permission. I said I'd spent 18 years listening to adoption jokes, and I wanted to know the truth about where I came from. My father stood up and told me those DNA tests were scams that gave random results to make money, and I shouldn't believe anything from a mail-order genetics company. My mother stayed silent, staring at her hands, and I noticed she wouldn't look at me. I opened the laptop and showed them the results, pointing out the ethnicity breakdown that matched nothing in their backgrounds. My father barely glanced at the screen before saying the tests were often wrong and mixed up samples and I'd wasted my money. I asked my mother directly if she'd given birth to me, and she finally looked up with tears in her eyes and said of course she had. I was her son. I asked why my DNA showed no genetic connection to either of them, and my father said that was impossible, and the test was clearly defective. When I showed them the list of genetic matches with names they didn't recognize, my mother stood up and left the room. My father told me to shut the laptop and stop upsetting my mother with conspiracy theories and pseudoscience. I followed my mother to the kitchen where she was gripping the counter and crying silently. I asked her again if I was adopted, and she turned around and said through tears that she'd carried me for 9 months and given birth to me and raised me, and how dare I question that. I asked why my DNA didn't match theirs, and she said she didn't know, but there had to be an explanation that didn't involve me being someone else's child. When I asked if she was absolutely certain I was biologically hers, she slapped me across the face hard enough to leave a mark. My father appeared in the doorway and told me to go to my room and think about what I'd done to hurt my mother, and I left before things could escalate further. Victor messaged me that weekend asking if I'd learned anything new. I told him my parents denied everything and insisted the DNA test was wrong, even though they couldn't explain the results. Victor wrote back saying DNA doesn't lie, and if I showed no genetic connection to my stated parents, then either I was adopted, or there was a switched at birth situation, or something else had happened they weren't telling me. He said he'd done more research on his end and found a branch of his family tree that had lived in the same city where I was born 18 years ago. He asked if I'd be willing to share more details about my birth and early childhood, anything that might help him figure out where I actually fit into his family line. I searched my father's office while my parents were at work, looking through filing cabinets for anything related to my birth or adoption. I found Vanessa's birth certificate in a folder, along with her hospital bracelet and footprints, and a congratulations card from the hospital. My documents were in a separate folder with just the birth certificate and nothing else. No hospital memorabilia or cards or photos from the hospital. I found my parents' tax returns going back 20 years and noticed they'd never claimed an adoption credit or any unusual expenses around the time of my birth. I photographed everything and sent the images to Victor, asking if any of this meant anything significant. Victor called me directly that evening, which surprised me since we'd only communicated through messages before. His voice was serious when he said he'd been looking at the documents and something didn't add up. He asked if I'd ever seen photos of my mother pregnant with me, and I realized I hadn't, only photos of her pregnant with Vanessa. He asked if I'd been born at the same hospital as my sister, and I checked both birth certificates and confirmed different hospitals. Victor said that was unusual for a family to switch hospitals without a reason, and he asked if my parents had lived in different places when we were born. I told him we'd always lived in the same house, and he went quiet for a moment before saying he wanted me to take another DNA test from a different company to confirm the results. The second DNA test arrived 3 days later, and I processed it immediately and sent it back with expedited shipping. While waiting for those results, I started digging into my parents' history using public records and social media. My father's Facebook went back 12 years with photos of our family, but I noticed something strange. The earliest photos that included me looked like I was already 3 or 4 years old, not an infant or toddler. I searched my mother's social media and found the same pattern, with Vanessa's baby photos extensively documented, but my early childhood mysteriously absent until I was past the toddler stage. When I asked my mother why there weren't more baby photos of me, she said their camera had broken and they'd lost a lot of early pictures in a move, but we'd never moved from our house. The second DNA test results came back matching the first one exactly, showing the same ethnicity breakdown and the same list of genetic relatives, with Victor still appearing as a close match. I took screenshots of both results side by side and showed them to my parents at dinner. My father threw his napkin down and said I was obsessed with this DNA nonsense and needed to let it go. My mother started crying again and said I was destroying our family over computer algorithms that didn't understand real relationships. Vanessa asked what was happening, and my father told her to go to her room, but she stayed and looked at me with confusion and what might have been fear. I told Vanessa our parents had been joking about me being adopted my entire life, and now DNA tests showed they were telling the truth all along. Vanessa looked at our parents and asked if that was real, and my mother said of course not. The tests were wrong, and I was her son. My father added that I was trying to hurt the family because I'd always been ungrateful for everything they'd done for me. I asked them to take DNA tests themselves to prove the results were wrong, and my father refused immediately, saying he wouldn't waste money to prove something he already knew. My mother said taking a test would validate my accusations, and she wouldn't participate in this attack on our family. Victor sent me information about a woman named Layla who'd lived in my birth city 18 years ago and had a son who would be my age now. He'd found her through obituaries and public records, and according to his research, she was distantly related to him through his grandmother's side of the family. Layla had died in a car accident when her son was 3 years old, and after that, the child disappeared from all public records. No death certificate, no foster care placement, no adoption records that Victor could find. He asked if I was willing to consider that I might be that missing child, and if so, I had biological relatives who'd been searching for information about what happened after Layla died. I researched Layla obsessively, finding her obituary, which mentioned a 3-year-old son named Julian, but didn't list where the child had gone after her death. Her obituary mentioned parents named Rashid and Nora, who were listed as residing in the same city where I was born. I found Rashid's current address through public records and sat in my car outside his house for an hour trying to decide if I should knock on the door. An elderly man who matched Rashid's age came out to water his garden, and I watched him move slowly with a cane, and I couldn't make myself approach him with questions that might destroy whatever peace he'd found after losing his daughter. My parents found searches for Layla and Rashid on our shared family computer and confronted me in my bedroom. My father demanded to know why I was looking up random people, and I told them about Victor's research connecting me to a woman who died 16 years ago. My mother's face went completely white, and my father told me to stop investigating things that were none of my business. I asked if they'd known Layla, and my father said they'd never heard that name before in their lives. My mother couldn't speak, just stood there shaking, and I knew in that moment that they'd been lying about everything since the day they brought me into their house. I packed a bag that night and told my parents I was staying with a friend until they decided to tell me the truth. My father said if I left the house, I shouldn't bother coming back, and my mother begged me to stay and work this out as a family. I asked one more time if I was adopted, and when neither of them answered, I walked out the door with my bag and drove to my friend Kyle's house. Kyle's parents let me stay in their guest room after I explained I was having problems at home, and Kyle's mother said I could stay as long as I needed. She asked if I was safe, and I told her I wasn't in physical danger, just trying to figure out who I actually was. Victor called me the next morning and said he'd found something important. He'd located Layla's mother, Nora, in a nursing home and had spoken with the staff about whether she'd be able to handle questions about her lost grandson. The nursing director said Nora had dementia and her memories were unreliable, but she occasionally talked about a grandson named Julian who'd been taken from her. Victor asked if I wanted him to set up a meeting, and I said yes, before I could talk myself out of it. We arranged to meet at the nursing home the following Saturday, and Victor said he'd bring documentation of our DNA connection and Layla's family tree to show Nora. The nursing home smelled like antiseptic and cafeteria food, and Nora was sitting in a common room looking out the window when we arrived. Victor introduced himself and me, and when he said my name was Julian, Nora's head turned and her eyes focused on my face with sudden clarity. She reached out a shaking hand and touched my cheek and said, I looked just like my mother. I asked if she meant Layla, and she nodded and started crying, saying she'd prayed every day to find out what happened to her grandson. Victor showed her the DNA results and explained how he'd traced the family connection, and Nora held my hand and said they'd told her I died in the same accident that killed Layla. I asked Nora who had told her that, and she said the social worker who'd come to the hospital after the accident. Layla had been driving with me in the car when a truck ran a red light, and Layla died at the scene while I'd been taken to the hospital with minor injuries. Nora had been out of the country visiting family when it happened, and by the time she got back to the States, she was told her grandson had died from complications. She'd buried an empty casket next to her daughter and spent 16 years believing we were both gone. Victor asked if she remembered the social worker's name, and Nora said it was a woman named Barbara who'd handled all the arrangements, but she couldn't remember a last name. I showed Nora photos of my parents on my phone, and her face changed from confusion to recognition to anger. She said the woman in the photo was Barbara, the social worker who'd told her I was dead. My mother wasn't a social worker, she was a nurse, but in the chaos after the accident, she could have claimed any role she wanted. Nora said Barbara had been very insistent that she shouldn't view my body and should trust that everything had been handled properly. Looking back, Nora realized she'd been manipulated by someone who'd stolen her grandson and convinced her he was dead. Victor and I went to the police station with Nora's statement and the DNA evidence. The detective who took our report looked skeptical at first, but as I explained the 18 years of adoption jokes and the DNA results and Layla's accident, his expression shifted to something more serious. He said this would require investigation into old records and possibly charging my parents with kidnapping and fraud, which could take months or years to build a case. I asked what I should do in the meantime, and he said I should stay somewhere safe and not confront my parents until the investigation had progressed. He took copies of all our documentation and said someone would be in contact soon. My parents' house was empty when I went back with a police escort to collect my belongings. The officer waited in the living room while I packed everything I owned into boxes and bags. I found a locked box in my mother's closet and used a screwdriver to open it, discovering documents inside with Layla's name and mine, Julian Okoye, along with the original accident report and hospital records. There were also legal documents showing my mother had falsified social worker credentials to gain access to me after the accident, and papers showing they'd moved me to a different hospital where they'd claimed to be my parents. I gave everything to the police officer, who bagged it as evidence and said this changed everything about the investigation. The arrest happened 3 days later when detectives showed up at my parents' jobs with warrants. My father was charged with conspiracy to commit kidnapping and fraud, while my mother faced additional charges of identity theft and filing false documents. Vanessa called me crying, asking what was happening and why police were taking our parents away. I explained everything as gently as I could, and she said she didn't believe any of it because our parents loved us and wouldn't do something like this. I told her to look at the evidence herself when she was ready, and we'd talk when she could process what was happening. Rashid opened his door when I knocked, and I introduced myself as Julian, his grandson. He stared at my face for a long moment before pulling me into a hug and crying against my shoulder. He said he'd believed I was dead for 16 years, and finding out I was alive felt like a miracle he didn't deserve. We sat in his living room while I told him everything about growing up with people who'd stolen me, and he told me about Layla and what my mother had been like before she died. He showed me photos of her holding me as a baby, and I could see the resemblance that my adoptive parents had spent 18 years pretending didn't exist. The trial took 11 months to reach court, and by then, the evidence against my parents was overwhelming. The defense tried to argue they genuinely believed they were helping a child in need, but the falsified documents and the adoption jokes recorded in family videos undermined that narrative. My testimony about 18 years of psychological abuse disguised as humor helped establish their awareness of what they'd done. Vanessa testified for the defense, saying our parents had been good to both of us, but she couldn't explain why they'd treated us so differently or why they'd joked about my adoption if I was really their biological child. My mother was sentenced to 12 years for kidnapping, identity theft, and fraud. My father received 8 years for conspiracy and accessory charges. Both were ordered to pay restitution to Rashid and Nora for emotional damages, though no amount of money could compensate for 16 years of grief. Vanessa cut contact with me completely after the sentencing, blaming me for destroying our family. I tried to explain that I hadn't destroyed anything. I'd just uncovered what our parents had destroyed long before, but she wouldn't hear it. She moved in with my father's sister and refused to acknowledge me when we passed each other on campus. Rashid invited me to move into his house, and I accepted. He taught me about my real heritage, stories about Layla's childhood, family recipes passed down through generations. Nora's dementia progressed, but she had moments of clarity where she'd recognize me and smile. Victor became a close friend, the cousin who'd helped me find my way back to my real family. We'd have dinners with Rashid where Victor would share newly discovered family history, connecting branches of our tree that had been lost over time. College applications had to be redone with my legal name restored to Julian Okoye. I wrote my essay about identity and truth, about growing up stolen and finding my way home. Admissions officers called it the most compelling essay they'd read that year. I was accepted to my first choice with a full scholarship, and Rashid cried when I showed him the acceptance letter. He said Layla would be proud of the man I'd become, despite everything that had been taken from me. The woman I'd called mother for 18 years sent letters from prison that I didn't open. My father's letters I read once and then burned. his justifications and excuses turning to ash like the childhood he'd stolen. Vanessa sent one email saying she hoped I was happy now that I'd gotten what I wanted, and I wrote back saying I'd never wanted any of this. I just wanted the truth. She never responded. Sometimes families break along fault lines that were always there, and the breaking reveals what was real and what was performance all along. 5 years after finding Rashid, I stood at Layla's grave with flowers and told my mother I'd made it. I'd survived and found my way home. Rashid stood beside me with his hand on my shoulder, and I felt the weight of belonging that I'd never felt with the people who'd stolen me. The adoption jokes had been cruel truth disguised as humor, my parents' way of maintaining power through psychological torture masked as family bonding. They'd spent 18 years making me doubt my place in their family, while knowing I never belonged there at all. But now, I stood with my real family, the one connected by blood and choice and love that didn't require diminishment. Justice had come slowly and incompletely, as it often does, but I'd found something more valuable than revenge. I'd found the truth of who I was, and that truth had set me free from 18 years of being someone else's stolen son, their joke, their secret kept in plain sight. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.